Shannon.
Gugh.
I'm sorry. Well, I just wanted to come in and let you know that I'm off for the night, but I'm hoping to see you maybe tomorrow morning. We have another nurse coming in. I'll be in soon to do report. But I just wanted to check in and let you know that it was fun working with you, and I will check back in with you if I see you next morning. Okay, are you just getting on? Okay, well, anyways, I am so excited to go home. I have been working non-stop, and it's the end of 12 hours, and it's my 4th day in a row doing 12s, and I had to do an overtime a couple days before, and I'm just exhausted. So I'm excited to get my 6 hours of sleep and then be back in the morning.
Shannon, it sounds like you've been worked to the bone.
Oh, Shannon. Oh, hey. Can you work this night? Please? No one else is here. Everyone's gone home. We're down like a whole nurse. We really need you. I'm just getting off at 12 and I've pulled 12s the last 4 nights. Is there anyone else? No. You're literally my only hope. Okay. I guess I'll stay. Thank you so much.
No problem, I'll just get this stuff back on.
Alright, thank you. You're a lifesaver.
I'm a lifesaver. You hear that? That's what you told me yesterday. Seems right.
The staff's not that bad. You know, I mean, most of the staff's.
Picture this. You're waking up right from surgery, and you see a nurse over you fiddling with your PCA pump, and she's yawning like crazy. Later, you find that she's been on shift for 14 hours. Are you going to feel safe? I wouldn't either. In order to provide the best patient care, it is important that the nurse takes care of her physical and mental health. Evidence has shown that working long or extensive hours or beyond a scheduled shift can lead to negative patient and nurse outcomes. Nurses have a number of reasons for wanting to do this. Maybe they want more money, maybe they are just helping out, or they feel an obligation to help out like you saw in the video, or maybe they're trying to make up for some time. But studies have shown that nurse overtime has been used as a solution to treat chronic understaffing and variations in the patient census, and that is not okay. An important concept to address is the ANA Nursing Code of Ethics, which is really important for any nurse practicing today. The first one is that the nurse's primary commitment is to the patient, whether an individual, family, group, or community. That is provision 2, and very important to remember. The second provision is that the nurse promotes, advocates for, and strives to protect the health, safety, and rights of the patient. The third is that the nurse is responsible and accountable for individual nursing practices and determines the appropriate delegation of tasks consistent with the nurse's obligation to provide optimum patient care. And the last is the nurse participates in establishing, maintaining, and improving health environment and conditions of employment conducive to the provision of quality health care and consistent with the values of the profession through individual and collective action. None of these things can happen if a nurse is overworked or burned out. A tired nurse is an ineffective nurse.
So there's a lot of different players when there is a tired nurse. So of course the first one is the nurse. If they get tired, then they're the ones overexerting themselves, which cannot be good for any of our bodies. Second one is the nurses' families, because they're the ones that have to deal with the nurses when they're tired, and tiredness can definitely put a strain on all relationships. And then another one is doctors and other healthcare providers, because they're the ones that have to work with the nurses, and again, that can put a strain on the relationship, and if the relationship between the nurse and the doctor isn't very good, the patient's going to be hindered. And then another one is patients and families, because if a nurse makes a bad judgment or a mistake, it can also affect the patient's health. And it also can hinder the relationships between the nurse and the patient, which is really important. And then the last, it also affects hospital staff, like legal staff, because if a nurse is on a long shift and is tired, she's more prone to make mistakes, and then mistakes have to go to legal ramifications.
A recent study out of Europe analyzed the schedules of over 25,000 nurses and the impact these schedules had on their personal life, patient safety, and job satisfaction. The study showed that 94.8% of nurses who already worked 12-hour shifts had been asked to cover some overtime for a nurse who either didn't show up or couldn't make it into the hospital due to illness or accident. These nurses reported working overtime at least twice a month with little to no advance notice. Nurses working 10 to 12-hour shifts report often being dissatisfied with the staff handovers at the end of an extended shift change. And 40.7% of nurses worry about making errors when they're tired due to these ineffective communications. Another study also recently showed that nurses working 10 to 12 hours report lower overall health scores than those working 8 hours, primarily due to fatigue and family role strain. In a Canadian study of nurse managers, 19 of these managers, 40% of the 47 surveyed, reported being aware of situations where nurse tiredness had led to incidents or error affecting patient care. 47% of these nurse managers also reported being aware of staff injuries or near injuries that occurred on the drive home after extended shifts. This includes falling asleep at the wheel, missing red lights, or collisions with other pedestrians or other vehicles. While 62% of nurses report getting 6 to 7 hours of sleep before their next shift, 36% of nurses also report using chemical sleep aids to achieve such sleep, which we know can have potential ramifications if a nurse is drowsy as a result of these medications.
So how are we going to fix the problem of excessive overtime and nurse fatigue? According to a study in the Journal of American Medical Association, each additional patient over 4 per nurse carried a 23% risk of increased burnout and a 15% decrease in job satisfaction. This was in a 2002 survey when patients weren't as sick and there were more nurses. We're now in a shortage of nurses and it's harder to get that patient ratio right. And that can also increase hours worked and such. So one of the solutions that we came up with was adding staff. Maybe even just one nurse. And this nurse could be responsible for a 1-to-1 ratio patient. They could carry their own patient load, or they could just be an extra set of hands, which as nurses we hope that we have 6 pairs of hands. We would love that, but that's just not the case sometimes. So adding an extra nurse to staff could be a great option. Pros of this would be the reduced patient load on other nurses and increased patient satisfaction, as well as with hourly rounding, you would have more time with your patient if you have more nurses and a less patient to nurse ratio. Also, a con would be the shortage of nurses that we're in now, and that the hospital would have to hire extra staff, which would cost extra money. And while this seems like a huge issue, the hiring extra people or having more nursing staff that would cost more money, ultimately if you fix the problem you're going to get a better return. And so from the U.S. Department of Labor in 2012, RNs had about 12,000 incidents of back, neck, and shoulder injuries, resulting in an average of 8 days away from work. Among all healthcare practitioners and technical occupations, there were 65,000 non-fatal occupational injuries and illnesses that required an average of 7 days away from work. So you see, if we are constantly having extra nurses adding to the stress of calling in sick or something like that, and are required to stay overtime, then we're seeing a greater increase in job satisfaction and fatigue from those nurses while these nurses are recovering. And if you're seeing less sick days and fewer job-related injuries and patient medical errors and things like that, you'll see a greater return on investment, and ultimately the money you spend could save you from further litigations or things like that.
Another solution would be utilizing an on-call system for nurses. Many departments, like the OR, use on-call systems, and they have found them to be helpful and useful in meeting the demand of short staffing, unexpected illness, or incident. Some of the pros are that the staff are trained in this department and available specifically for these occasions. They work regular shifts in the hospital as well as an occasional on-call shift, so they are up to date with policies and procedures as well as up to date with their skills. The staff are also still paid for these on-call days, which is a benefit. It's not just an extra day that they're required to work. Some of the cons may be that this is costly to employ another nurse that may or may not be utilized for the day. And if not scheduled properly, this can increase fatigue and make the problem worse. So a recommendation would be to implement the on-call system for that department and schedule nurses appropriately. So including a one-day buffer on either side of that call day, so that they're not coming right off of a shift and they're not going right into a shift. Another recommendation would be that a nurse would be within an hour and a half of the hospital. So he or she would be available to be in the hospital to relieve that nurse in an hour and a half. Then a nurse who would be going off shift, is instead of working 4 extra hours, is working just an hour or an hour and a half extra. Why this would be a good idea is that it allows for support if necessary, and it's a good alternative to overtime work as it reduces that time worked overtime.
So the next solution that we thought of was a float pool for nursing. So the pros are float nurses would work on a variety of units instead of just their one unit, and this would relieve the hospital of having units that really need extra nurses. Another pro is that one article talked about how float nursing would be great for new RNs because they would get an experience of working at all different units, and RNs or new RNs are really willing to learn, and they can adapt really easily to their surroundings. It's more cost effective to have all staff members be part of a float process because it would decrease the amount of employees that each unit would actually need, and by using these regularly employed staff members, the cost could be reduced for the hospital. Another pro is that nurses wouldn't have to work those double shifts. They could work one shift, then go home. And then the last pro was that nurses would still work their normal shifts instead of being on call or having to work extra shifts. They could just work their normal shift and maybe go to a different unit. And some cons for the float nursing is that float nurses don't get to work on the same floor all the time, so they don't get to have that unit community. If every unit needs a float nurse, then there may not be enough nurses to go around the entire hospital. And lastly, hospital orientees wouldn't be part of the float pool right away because they would need to be oriented to the hospital first, and then they could be part of that float process. So some recommendations for this solution is that, like I just said, hospital employees wouldn't be able to work right away. They'd have to have like a 90-day orientation session before. And then another recommendation is have different float pools. So one for pediatrics, one for newborns, and one for other kinds. Because you don't want a nurse that normally works in geriatrics to go work with babies, because they're not used to that. And I really like this idea of float nursing just because it uses the hospital nurses to take the extra shifts.
So how we would want to evaluate these solutions, we would want to use satisfaction surveys for both nurses and patients, follow-up surveys to show a decrease in patient injury and errors in patient care. We'd also want to see a decreased incident report reported from hospitals and charge nurses. The U.S. Census Bureau and Department of Labor would also be a good resource for us to use. They annually collect data regarding job satisfaction and work-related incidences. How we would also see this would be an increase in job satisfaction and patient satisfaction, and a decrease in nurse-reported fatigue and error, as well as a decrease in nurse-related injury after extended shifts, and a decrease in sentinel events for our patients.